To save her brother from debt, she agrees to a contract marriage with a cold-hearted CEO, but their first night changes everything. The cold air in Alexander Sinclair's office was suffocating. The towering glass windows showcased a breathtaking view of the city skyline, but Isabella Reed barely noticed. Her mind was spinning, her pulse racing as she sat across from the man who held her family's fate in his hands. Alexander Sinclair. The name alone sent chills down her spine. CEO of Sinclair Enterprises, ruthless, calculating, untouchable, and the only man who could save her brother. Her fingers clenched into fists in her lap. "You can't be serious," she whispered, her voice barely above a breath. Across the desk, Alexander leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. "I don't make jokes when it comes to business, Miss Reed." Isabella swallowed hard. Jake, her only family, had made a reckless investment, trusting the wrong people, and now he was drowning in millions of dollars in debt. Debt he could never repay. Alexander steepled his fingers, watching her struggle with the decision he had just thrown in her lap. She forced herself to meet his icy gaze. "You're saying that if I agree to marry you, you'll erase Jake's debt?" Alexander inclined his head. "That's the offer." Isabella exhaled sharply. "And if I refuse?" His lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. "Then your brother's creditors will come for him. And we both know what happens to men who owe money they can't pay." Her stomach twisted. This wasn't a proposal. It was a cage dressed up in expensive suits and legal documents. She squared her shoulders, forcing steel into her voice. "So that's it? You want a wife? And I just happen to be the one unfortunate enough to be caught in your web." Alexander remained eerily calm. "I need a wife for exactly 1 year, that's all." Her mind raced. 1 year. 1 year of being tied to a man she didn't trust, didn't even like. But the alternative? Losing Jake forever. She had no choice. With trembling hands, Isabella reached for the contract in front of her and signed away her freedom. The wedding happened just 3 days later. There was no excitement, no nervous anticipation, only business. The ceremony was flawlessly orchestrated, expensive floral arrangements, a 5-star venue, and a guest list, but it was devoid of any warmth. Isabella walked down the aisle in an elegant white gown, her heart pounding, not with joy, but with the weight of her decision. At the end of the aisle stood Alexander, dressed in a sharp black tuxedo, his expression unreadable. He didn't look at her with love. He barely looked at her at all. And when the officiant asked if he took her as his wife, his voice was emotionless. "I do. I do." It was over in minutes. The reception was just as sterile. A room full of powerful people whispering behind their champagne glasses, speculating on why the untouchable Alexander Sinclair had suddenly taken a wife. The media had a field day. Isabella Reed, gold digger or the luckiest woman alive? Alexander Sinclair's surprise marriage, business move, or secret romance? She didn't care what they thought. But when she caught sight of her brother, standing at the back of the room with tears in his eyes, she reminded herself why she had done this. Jake was safe. That was all that mattered. By the time they arrived at Alexander's massive penthouse, Isabella's body was exhausted, but her mind was wide awake. This was it. Their wedding night. She stood in the center of the luxurious bedroom, her hands trembling slightly as she turned to face him. Alexander loosened his tie, his movements slow and deliberate. "I'll be sleeping in the guest room," he said flatly. Isabella blinked. "What?" He met her gaze, his eyes void of any warmth. "You didn't think this was a real marriage, did you?" Something inside her clenched. "I don't know what I expected," she admitted. Alexander exhaled, rubbing his temple as if this entire conversation exhausted him. "This is a contract, Isabella. You're my wife on paper, nothing more." Her chest tightened, but she refused to show weakness. She lifted her chin. "Then why did you marry me at all?" His jaw tensed. "Because I needed to." That was it. No explanation. No attempt to soften the blow. Just cold, hard truth. He turned to leave, pausing at the doorway. For a brief second, she thought he might say something else. But he didn't. He simply walked out, leaving her alone in a room that suddenly felt too big, too empty. And for the first time since she signed the contract, Isabella felt the full weight of what she had agreed to. She was a wife without a husband. And this was only the beginning. If Isabella had thought her new life as Mrs. Sinclair would come with at least a semblance of normalcy, she was dead wrong. From the moment she stepped into Alexander's world, she realized just how much of a business transaction this marriage truly was. Her days were scheduled down to the minute, appearances at corporate events, carefully curated public outings, and a never-ending parade of formal galas. But through it all, Alexander never touched her, never even looked at her longer than necessary. The first event they attended together was a black-tie charity gala. Isabella had spent hours getting ready, her makeup flawless, her gown hugging her figure perfectly. She had expected at least a nod of acknowledgement when Alexander saw her. Instead, he barely glanced at her before offering his arm, his grip impersonal. When they arrived at the event, he leaned in, his voice a low whisper against her ear. "Smile. Look happy. That's all you need to do." So she did. She played her part perfectly, smiling at the right moments, answering polite questions, pretending to be the devoted wife of a powerful man. But Alexander kept his distance. Even when reporters tried to get a romantic shot of them, he simply placed a hand on the small of her back, nothing more. As the night went on, Isabella realized this was her new reality. A marriage where she was present but invisible. And then, the list of rules came. Delivered in a neat folder by his assistant the next morning. She read them with growing disbelief. No interference in his personal life. No expectations of affection. No discussions about the past or the future. After 1 year, she would leave, no exceptions. Isabella clenched the papers, a bitter laugh escaping her lips. She had officially signed up for a year-long prison sentence. Life with Alexander was a constant push and pull. He wasn't just cold, he was downright infuriating. Every morning he would leave for work without a word, barely acknowledging her presence. Every evening he would return late, head straight to his office, and shut the door. At first, Isabella tried to ignore it, tried to live like a ghost in his home. But she wasn't built to be silent. One night, after yet another awkward dinner where Alexander had barely spoken a full sentence to her, she had enough. She followed him into his office, arms crossed. "This is ridiculous," she snapped. Alexander didn't even look up from his laptop. "Be more specific." "This," she gestured around them. "This entire situation. You don't talk to me. You don't even look at me unless we're in public." He exhaled, finally meeting her gaze. "We have a deal, Isabella." She scoffed. "A deal doesn't mean you have to act like I don't exist." His jaw tightened. "And what do you expect? For me to pretend we're in love?" "No," she shot back. "But I expect basic human decency." Silence stretched between them. For the first time, Alexander looked uncertain. Like he hadn't anticipated that she would fight back. He sighed, rubbing his temple. "Go to bed, Isabella." She narrowed her eyes. "You don't get to dismiss me like one of your employees." His eyes darkened, a flicker of something dangerous in them. "This marriage is a contract, Isabella. Nothing more. The sooner you accept that, the easier it will be." She held his gaze, refusing to back down. "You might be fine living in a loveless marriage, but I won't let you treat me like I don't exist." For the first time, Alexander had no response. And as she turned and walked away, he realized something unsettling. He had underestimated her. The fever hit Isabella out of nowhere. One moment, she was going about her day as usual, dealing with the cold indifference of her husband, pretending their marriage wasn't just a business transaction. The next, she was curled up in bed, shivering violently, her entire body aching. She didn't call for help. She knew Alexander didn't care. He barely acknowledged her existence unless it was for the sake of the media. But late that night, through the haze of her fever, she felt a cool hand press against her forehead. A deep voice, unexpectedly soft, murmured, "Damn it, Isabella." She forced her eyes open, her vision blurry. But even in the dim light, she recognized Alexander's face above hers, his brows furrowed, his usually emotionless expression replaced with something unfamiliar. Worry. Or was she imagining it? He sighed, sitting on the edge of the bed, pressing a damp cloth to her burning skin. "You should have told me you weren't feeling well." A weak laugh escaped her lips. "Would you have cared?" His jaw tightened, but he didn't answer. Instead, he carefully adjusted the covers around her, making sure she was warm. His touch was gentle, precise, so unlike the cold businessman she had come to know. In her fevered state, Isabella almost let herself believe that maybe, just maybe, there was more to Alexander Sinclair than the ruthless CEO who had bought her into this marriage. But by the time morning came, he was gone. And when she woke up, alone in the massive bed, she convinced herself it had all been a dream. The gala was extravagant, a gathering of New York's wealthiest elite. Isabella had grown used to these events, putting on a perfect smile, standing beside Alexander like a well-trained accessory. But tonight felt different. Maybe it was because of what had happened the night before, because she had seen a glimpse of something real in him, and now she couldn't stop thinking about it. Or maybe it was because of the man currently leaning a little too close to her, his expensive cologne invading her senses. Richard Davenport, a well-known investor with a reputation for charming women just for sport. "You're far too stunning to be ignored the way Sinclair ignores you," Richard murmured, his hand grazing hers. Isabella forced a polite smile, stepping back slightly. "I think you're mistaken." "Oh, am I?" Richard smirked, tilting his head. "Because from where I'm standing, it seems like your husband doesn't appreciate what he has." Before Isabella could respond, a firm hand wrapped around her wrist, yanking her backward. She barely had time to react before Alexander's towering frame positioned itself between her and Richard, his grip possessive, his jaw clenched tight. The entire ballroom seemed to freeze. Alexander's voice was deceptively calm, but Isabella could feel the rage simmering beneath it. "She's not available for conversation, Davenport." Richard chuckled, completely unfazed. "Ah, there he is, the infamous Alexander Sinclair. I was starting to think you didn't care what your wife did." Alexander's hold on Isabella tightened, just for a second. Then, without another word, he turned and led her out of the ballroom. Isabella barely kept up with his long strides as he pulled her onto the empty terrace. The cool night air hit her flushed skin, but it did nothing to cool the storm in Alexander's eyes. "What the hell was that?" he demanded. She ripped her wrist from his grasp, eyes flashing. "Excuse me, you were flirting with him." She let out a sharp, bitter laugh. "Oh, now you care? That's interesting, considering you've spent this entire marriage pretending I don't exist." His hands clenched into fists at his sides. "You're my wife, Isabella." "Oh, am I?" she shot back. "Because most of the time you treat me like an inconvenience." His nostrils flared, and before she could say another word, he closed the distance between them in one swift motion. And then he kissed her. It wasn't gentle. It wasn't sweet. It was possessive, desperate, a battle of control. Isabella's mind screamed at her to push him away, to remind him that this wasn't real. But her traitorous body responded before she could stop it. Her fingers curled into his tuxedo, her lips parting against his, her entire world tilting on its axis. But just as quickly as it began, Alexander pulled away. His breathing was heavy, his hands still gripping her arms, as if he wasn't sure whether to let go or hold on tighter. For a brief moment, his mask slipped. And she saw it. The same desire. The same fear. The same confusion that she felt. But then, his walls slammed back into place. "This was a mistake," he muttered, releasing her abruptly. Isabella's heart plummeted. And as he turned and walked away, leaving her standing alone on the terrace, she realized something that terrified her more than anything else. She had fallen for him, and he was never going to let himself love her back. The days after the kiss were agonizing. Alexander returned to his usual distant self. If anything, he was even colder than before. Isabella should have expected it. She should have known better. But that didn't stop the ache in her chest every time he avoided her gaze. She tried to pretend it didn't matter, that she hadn't spent countless nights thinking about the way he had kissed her, that she hadn't hoped, just for a second, that maybe he felt something too. But it was useless. Because every time he spoke to her, his words were clipped, controlled. Because he refused to acknowledge what had happened between them. Because he was pretending it hadn't meant anything. And that hurt more than anything else. One evening, as she lay awake in their enormous, empty bed, staring at the ceiling, she let herself whisper the truth she had been avoiding. "I love him." The words felt like a curse. Because she knew, no matter how much she loved him, Alexander Sinclair would never love her back. Alexander Sinclair had always believed that love was just another weakness. He had built his life around control, over his business, his image, his emotions. And for years that control had been unshakable. Until her. Until Isabella. Ever since that night on the terrace, when he had kissed her, truly kissed her, he hadn't been able to think straight. She was getting under his skin in ways he never expected. He couldn't stop watching her. He found himself seeking her out, even when he told himself not to. And that terrified him. Because he knew where love led. He had seen it firsthand, his mother, sobbing late into the night. His father, leaving without looking back. Love was a trap. A lie that only ended in pain. So he did the only thing he knew how to do. He pushed her away. He stopped speaking to her unless absolutely necessary. He worked longer hours, leaving early and coming home late. When he was home, he barely looked at her. And when she walked into a room, he walked out. But none of it helped. Because no matter how much distance he put between them, she was always there. In his thoughts. In the way his bed felt emptier than ever. In the way his heart clenched every time he saw the sadness in her eyes. But he couldn't let himself feel. Because if he did, if he let himself love her, he would be vulnerable. And Alexander Sinclair didn't do vulnerability. Isabella tried. God, she tried. She told herself that Alexander's distance didn't hurt. That she could endure his coldness. That maybe, just maybe, he would come around. But as the days turned into weeks, as the silence between them grew heavier, she realized the truth. He wasn't just avoiding her. He was rejecting her. And she couldn't do it anymore. One evening she sat alone in their bedroom, staring at the contract she had signed all those months ago. 1 year, that was the deal. But why wait? Why keep putting herself through this pain when she already knew how this would end? Taking a shaky breath, she reached for her suitcase. She was leaving. Not because she wanted to, but because staying would destroy her. She found Alexander in his office, working late as usual. When she stepped inside, he didn't even look up. That hurt more than it should have. "I want out," she said quietly. The words made his hands still over the keyboard. Slowly, he lifted his gaze, his expression carefully blank, too blank. "What?" Isabella forced herself to stay strong. "I'm leaving. I'm ending the contract early." Something flickered in his eyes, something she couldn't quite name. Then, just as quickly, it was gone. "Fine," he said, his voice devoid of emotion. "Fine." That was all he had to say. No protest, no questions, no hesitation. Just fine. She swallowed against the lump in her throat. "I'll have my things packed by morning." For a moment, she thought, hoped, that he would say something. That he would ask her to stay. But he just nodded, looking back at his laptop. Like she was just another business deal closing early. Her heart shattered. Without another word, she turned and walked away. And Alexander? He watched her go, his fists clenched so tightly his knuckles turned white. But he didn't stop her. Because he had convinced himself this was what he wanted. Alexander Sinclair had built his entire life around control. But now, sitting alone in his office, staring blankly at a contract he had no interest in reading, he realized he had lost it. It had been 2 weeks since Isabella left. 14 days. 336 hours. And not a single one of them had passed without her haunting him. At first, he told himself nothing had changed. That his life was exactly as it had been before she walked into it. That her absence didn't matter. But that was a lie. Because the penthouse felt too empty. Because he kept turning to speak to her, only to remember she wasn't there. Because every time he saw something that reminded him of her, a book she had left on the coffee table, the faint scent of her perfume lingering in their bedroom, his chest ached in a way he didn't understand. And then, one evening, as he sat at his desk drowning in the silence, it hit him. He loved her. He had loved her for a long time. But he had been too much of a coward to admit it. And now? Now, she was gone. And he had no one to blame but himself. But maybe, just maybe, it wasn't too late. Finding Isabella wasn't difficult. She had gone back to her old life, working at a small publishing house, living in a modest apartment. What was difficult was figuring out how to face her, how to undo the damage he had caused. And then, fate intervened. That night she was at a charity gala, one she had agreed to attend before their marriage ended. Alexander didn't hesitate. He walked into that ballroom with one purpose: to win her back. The moment he saw her, his breath caught. She was standing across the room, dressed in a deep blue gown, her hair cascading over her shoulders. She looked beautiful. But she wasn't smiling. And when her gaze met his, her expression turned to shock. A hush fell over the crowd as Alexander strode toward her, stopping just a few feet away. Isabella's voice was barely a whisper. "What are you doing here?" He took a deep breath, his heart pounding. "I was wrong," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. Her eyes widened. "Alexander." But he didn't let her finish. "I was wrong to push you away. I was wrong to let you leave." The room was completely silent now. All eyes were on them. He took another step closer, his voice raw, real. "I was afraid," he admitted. "Afraid of loving you. Afraid of what it would mean. Afraid of losing control." Her breath hitched, but she didn't look away. But then I realized something, he continued. He reached for her hand, his grip firm, desperate. I'm more afraid of living without you. A gasp rippled through the room. Tears welled in Isabella's eyes. I love you, he said, his voice breaking. I love you, and I don't care about control anymore. I just care about you. A single tear slipped down her cheek. And then she smiled. For weeks, Isabella had convinced herself this was over. That Alexander would never change. That he had never loved her. But standing here, looking into his eyes, she knew. He meant it. This was real. She let out a shaky laugh, wiping at her tears. You are such an idiot. A grin tugged at his lips. Yeah, but I'm your idiot. She exhaled, then whispered the words that had been sitting in her heart for far too long. I love you too. Before he could say another word, she threw her arms around him, burying her face against his chest. And for the first time in his life, Alexander Sinclair knew he was exactly where he was meant to be. The sun was setting over the city skyline, casting golden light through the windows of the penthouse. But this time, it wasn't cold and empty. This time, it was home. Isabella stood on the balcony, a warm breeze brushing against her skin. She never imagined she would be back here, at least not like this. Not as Alexander's real wife. Not as the woman he loved. She heard footsteps behind her, and then, a familiar warmth as strong arms wrapped around her waist. Alexander pressed a soft kiss to the side of her neck. What are you thinking about? She smiled, leaning into him. About how different things feel now. He turned her around to face him, his hands resting on her hips, his gaze softer than she had ever seen before. Good different, he asked. She reached up, brushing her fingers along his jaw. The best kind of different. He exhaled, then slowly dropped to one knee. Isabella's breath caught. She hadn't expected this, not tonight, not like this. But as she looked down at the man who had once been so closed off, so afraid of love, now kneeling before her with his heart completely open, she realized there was no moment more perfect than this one. Alexander pulled out a small velvet box, flipping it open to reveal a stunning diamond ring. I asked you to marry me once before, he said, his voice steady, but filled with emotion. And I did it for the wrong reasons. Her heart pounded. This time, he continued, there's no contract, no conditions, just you and me. Because I love you, Isabella. And I want to spend the rest of my life proving that to you. Tears welled in her eyes. Yes, she whispered. Then, with a teary laugh, she said it again. Yes, Alexander. He slid the ring onto her finger and stood, pulling her into his arms. She kissed him, slow and deep, knowing that this time, this was real. 1 year later. Laughter filled the penthouse. But it wasn't from them. It was from the tiny baby cradled in Alexander's arms. Isabella watched from the couch, her heart melting at the sight of her husband, her once cold, emotionless husband, gently rocking their newborn daughter. She looks just like you, Alexander murmured, brushing his fingers over the baby's soft cheek. Isabella smiled. And she already has you wrapped around her little finger. He glanced at her, a slow, knowing smile tugging at his lips, just like her mother. She reached over, lacing their fingers together. You don't regret anything, do you? He shook his head, his gaze never leaving hers. Not for a second. And as he leaned in, pressing a kiss to her forehead, Isabella knew. This was what love was meant to be. A choice, a home, a family. And she wouldn't change a thing. Isabella never expected that signing a marriage contract would lead her to the greatest love of her life. And Alexander? He never thought he was capable of love, until he almost lost it. Their journey wasn't perfect. It was cold, complicated, and filled with mistakes. But love isn't about perfection. It's about choosing someone, even when it's difficult. 1 year later, they stood together, not because of a contract, not because of obligation, but because they wanted to. Because they had built something real. And as Alexander held their newborn daughter in his arms, he finally understood love wasn't a weakness. It was the strongest thing he had ever known. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Soul Stirring Stories. Turn on notifications so you never miss another emotional, heartwarming tale, because sometimes the most unexpected stories lead to the most unforgettable love. Love doesn't always start perfectly, but the best ones always find a way.